Because I still work as an officer in this department, I'm going to keep my identity anonymous just for the sake of my own protection and my job. I could get seriously reprimanded for sharing this information by my superiors if they were able to trace this back to me. Back in 2013, I started working for the same PD that I still work for now. I had only been an officer for around a year this time and still felt new in certain situations, especially the one I was put in this very night. The county I work and operate in is smaller, so you get more of a sense of knowing a lot of the same people. Trust me, I've encountered the same drunks and addicts that we see along the roads many times, but that's not today's story. I'm going to share with you something a little different. This night, I was responding to a call, a noise complaint behind this smaller neighborhood. This neighborhood that I was going to was bordered by a small area of woods and a medium-sized body of water. Again, I'm purposely refraining from mentioning the lake or town because I don't want my name anywhere attached to this. This lake stretches on and streams out into a river that runs into a larger river just a few miles away. It was not uncommon to get noise complaint calls in this area, especially behind this neighborhood in this area, because teenagers would take it upon themselves to get drunk and rowdy and create a lot of noise in the summer nights partying. I'd gone a few other times to break up underage parties with drinking and sex in the same area before, late at night. I figured this would be just another run-of-the-mill call. I pulled into the address of the individual who placed the call about a noise complaint, and I asked the person if it was the same partying and music that had been happening previously, to which they responded no. They said they were hearing lots of strange loud animal noises that they could not describe. This had been going on for almost an hour and was so loud it was disturbing the neighbors around the area. This individual was not the only one to place a call about it that same night. This portion of the neighborhood I was in was directly in front of the wooded area, which then follows to the body of water. I went to inspect the area in question, not hearing any of the previously mentioned animal noises. Between a section of houses was a dead-end road that led directly to the heavily forested area, and then to the lake, or larger body of water. Upon approaching this area, I began scanning closely, looking for any signs of what could have been making a loud, disturbing animal noise. I found heaps upon heaps of beer cans and trashy blankets that were probably fresh, maybe from a night or two ago. It looked like somebody had been partying out here for a minute. After maybe 7 minutes of walking through the thicker forest and approaching the larger lake, the feeling around me felt very hostile. It was dead silent, not even crickets. Very unusual for a summer night like this, with clear skies. I began scanning the shoreline and area directly behind the neighborhood in question, looking for any clues. I began to feel multiple presences around me, from behind, in front, in the water, and off to my right in the woods. When you're an officer, there are certain situations where you don't have time to think, and you just have to react. I knew I was about to be in one of those just by the feeling alone. My initial thoughts were that I was about to get jumped or stabbed by possibly some junkies. I kept my hand close on my pistol and ready. The noises got closer and closer, and then stopped. I had stopped, shining my light around me directly to my right in the forest. Out of the brush stepped something that looks like it came right out of a Hollywood horror movie. When I tell you this, I need you to understand that as an officer, we're not trained to deal with these kinds of situations. If you have ever seen that movie in the 90s, I believe it's called Dinosaur. Whatever stepped out of the woods looked very identical to some of the creatures in that film. It reminded me of a half dinosaur, half human. Very reptilian looking, long snout, glowing yellow eyes, but a very humanoid body covered in thick skin. It showed its teeth right at me and hissed. The teeth on this creature were just like that of the velociraptors in Jurassic Park. Long, pointed, and tipped towards the inner part of the mouth, as in to hold in meat when it bit. I might be calm explaining these details out to you, But mind you, in the instance, I was petrified. I could not even unholster my weapon. This thing was as tall as I was, and I'm 6'3". I work out here and there, and I'm lean, but I'm not bulky by any means. This thing was very bulky. It looked like it could have bench pressed 3 of me any day of the week, any time. I was shining my light directly on it, and the details I saw were vivid. But when you're in that state of mind and panic, you don't perceive everything as you should. Whatever this was stood there, staring at me, hissing, showing its teeth, as if it was readying itself to lunge forward and attack. I don't know how to explain it, but I just knew I wasn't alone. The presence, the energy this thing gave off was horrendous. It was ominous, like you were going to die. I felt that same presence from all around me, and I just knew in my heart, in my soul, that it wasn't alone. I also knew that judging from the sound I was hearing around this creature, because there was more often the brush moving. After some time, I was able to finally come to a standoff, and I pulled out my firearm and fired 3 shots at this thing as it began to crouch back, as if getting ready to lunge. I knew I hit it with all 3 shots, because it made this horrible scream like I've never heard, and retreated back into the brush in which it appeared out of. The scream, howl, whatever this thing let out was so loud, it hurt my ears, and sounded nothing like any animal I had ever heard of before. I can't even think of a film to base it off of, because I have yet to hear something that sounded familiar or similar in sound. It was terrible. I used that opportunity to flee back to the area my cruiser was in and call for backup. I had encountered an unknown animal and was in far deeper than I could have ever imagined. The standoff between me and this creature probably only lasted 10 seconds at most, but it felt like 10 minutes. As soon as it started screaming and fleeing back into the brush, there was a frenzy all around me. Much of the brush surrounding me and in the area began moving and going crazy. I knew there was more of them, and I knew if I stuck around, I was going to be killed by whatever dinosaur thing I had run into. Within minutes, my supervisor, again, I'm not going to mention his name, arrived with more officers, and he resigned me from the call and told me not to talk about it or mention this ever. His actions and his demeanor were very strange, like something bigger was at foot. He and 3 other officers went into the area I was just in, and I was told to leave immediately. I was then relieved of duty the rest of my shift that night. There isn't much else to tell about the story. Life went on, and I continued serving as an officer in this county, and still do. That sheriff passed away last year from a stroke, but served the county for many years, well before I ever went into the academy and was known in the area. I've been wanting to share this experience for a long time, but never knew when or how I should go about it. I wish I could describe it better what I ran into that evening, but my best description is that it looked to be part dinosaur, part human, only there was just something so evil about it. The glowing yellow eyes, the face and teeth. It's like you took the head of a velociraptor from Jurassic Park and stuck it on the body of a humanoid lizard thing. I know that probably doesn't make any sense, but it's the best way I can describe it. I got the impression this thing was designed or created for killing. It had muscles rippling underneath its scales or flesh or lizard-like skin. Even though my light was on it for only a matter of seconds, it was enough for me to see the details and contours of its muscles underneath its lizard-like body. I have been in all sorts of extremely dangerous and hazardous situations as an officer, and that was the only one true time I've ever felt such genuine and absolute terror like that. It was beyond the fear of dying. It was like being in the presence of something truly evil. I don't know if it was an animal or whatever it was. I don't have an explanation for the sounds the neighbors were hearing before I responded to the call. Perhaps it was from these things that I saw that night. I sat down and listened to your reptilian encounters in the last few weeks, and after listening to them, I felt it was time to share my own story from my grandfather. Normally, I wouldn't share this kind of story, because not only did I think he was crazy, but I believe that many would find me crazy for sharing it. But, after hearing several stories that others had submitted to you, I feel that maybe I'm not so alone in what was shared with me by him. I knew about Bigfoot and stuff like that, but just recently came to the knowledge of knowing about other things on creatures. Cryptids, I guess they're called, like Dogman, Mothman. The list goes on and on. My grandfather, what he experienced and has the scars to prove, encountered what he described to me as crocodilian people of the swamp. I know that sounds far-fetched, and I didn't believe him at first, but bear with me. In your first episode of Reptilian Encounters, you shared a story about a person who had encountered very similar beings, like what my grandfather described attacking these villages in Africa. When I heard about that, I think it was probably my first epiphany that there might be some real weight to my grandfather's story, and not just some made-up far-fetched tale. Here's the other piece of the puzzle. This encounter my grandfather had cost him. One of these things completely tore off his leg, nearly ripped him open and disfigured his arm entirely. I always figured he had a bad run-in with an alligator, but things are starting to make more and more sense. My grandfather is well in his 90s and has always been a hardy, strong-willed person. He grew up with a hard life, and a lot of his brothers and sisters always told me that because he had survived the Great Depression, went through Pearl Harbor and Vietnam, it's really made him numb to the fear of man and the world. One of the few times he was ever truly terrified was this experience. My grandfather has done and seen it all. Farmed and survived the Great Depression, enlisted in the Army and survived Pearl Harbor, met his first wife, had kids, went on to serve in Vietnam, logged for a while, guided for a while, hunted, tracked professionally, all that crazy stuff. I also truly believe that how my grandfather survived was a miracle of God. Because of the condition he was found in, he should have bled out and died, but he didn't. He's alive to tell this story, and proves to me that miracles do happen. Anyway, here's the story. This happened in the late 70s. My granddad was out fishing deep in the bayous of Louisiana. He never disclosed the exact location, but he said it was away from other popular fishing spots at the time that the locals knew and his friends knew, and he would have to go in deep to certain spots to truly get the isolation feeling he loved so very much. He had a small boat he would go on and spend days fishing. Well, not being out there for days at a time, but would spend all day out there fishing, with plenty of food to eat while being out. He would go in the morning, come back at night, rinse and repeat. You get the idea. He knew about the dangers of the swamp life. Alligators, poisonous snakes, you name it. He always carried his famous Model 19 Magnum with him. He preferred it over his .357 due to its nifty size and weight, and being out in the swamp, he didn't want to be lugging anything that he didn't need to be lugged around. He usually always has a couple of spots he liked to go and visit, but noticed that on this day, the fish weren't really biting as usual. In fact, a lot of the swamp life seemed to be much more dull, is the word he described it. It wasn't as lively. In a pursuit to catch fish, and my grandfather being stubborn as a mule, he headed deeper in the swamp waters into unknown territory. He would do this often, so it wasn't a big deal being in areas that he had not yet explored. He said that the deeper he went in, it started to feel different, and couldn't describe what he meant. The brush was much thicker, and there was a lot less light coming through, making it harder to see. Even though it was bright as can be out with the sun, it still eclipsed some of the light. He would make several stops along as he kept venturing further to see if he could get a bite, but nothing. The further he ventured into this area, the duller it became, and the overwhelming feeling that he described was growing. The way he best described the area was that he shouldn't be there. I asked if he felt anything ominous or that he was going to die, and he told me no, but it didn't feel like that it was his place to be there. He had never felt that in the swamps or wilderness before. I should note that he has never had any sightings or encounters with Bigfoot, or anything like that that was said to be fiction. He didn't believe in any of that stuff anyway, and had spent countless time in the wilderness. So to him, that was the last thing to be thinking of. As he kept progressing further into this section of the swamp, desperate for fish, he had seen multiple alligators who swam past his boat swiftly, completely ignoring him. They seemed to be in a panic and in fear, as if they were swimming away from something, and rather swiftly. That should have been his first indicator that something was wrong and leave. But stubborn Grandpa pressed on. Instead of stopping for a fourth or fifth time to see if there were any fish or insect activity, he just decided to keep pressing on to a whole new area. He explored for probably what he recalls being maybe 40 minutes, if he had to guess. He had been out since the morning, and it was now late afternoon at this point, coming to the evening. The brush in this part was even thicker and had the least light, in combination with the sun shifting in the sky due to the time of day. It made it seem almost dusk-like. On the verge of giving up and about to turn around to go home, he gives it one last shot to see if he can get anything. He tells me he knew better. What little signs of life there was before this was now nothing. There was barely any insects around, let alone signs of fish. He said it felt very unusual, and that he felt very unwelcome now, even more so than previously stated. He talked about how those feelings were more intense than ever, but were not going to let that stop him from doing what he was out there to do. This is the part of the story where things go south very, very quickly. His line is cast into the water, and he's maybe spent about 10 minutes. He's waiting for anything at this point, and feels a large bump underneath his boat and rocks. Not hard, but enough that he thinks it's a big fish, and gets excited. The next thing he knows, out of the water, coming to greet him face to face, was this thing he believes came from the pits of hell itself. He said it had the head that resembled a crocodile, but much more hideous and distorted looking. Those were his words, not mine. With the upper body and arms resembling that of a human, with long black claws. This thing comes out of the water on the side of his boat that he's facing, grabs onto the side of the boat, and pulls him into the water in one motion. The force of this thing grabbing onto him and pulling him in capsized his small boat. He was immediately pulled down into the mud and silt below the water, but was able to break loose of the grasp that this thing held against him. He resurfaced and managed to almost pull himself back onto his capsized boat. As he's pulling himself up, this creature resurfaces behind him and bites onto his right leg, then grabbing onto it, and in a ripping motion above the knee, rips and pulls his entire leg off, with his now bone exposed. He was able to make his way lying flat on the top of his capsized boat and out of the water, when the second one of these things, slightly differing in color and variation, he describes, comes out of the water from the opposite side and nearly rips his right arm off with its claws, severely disfiguring his arm, but not ripping it off. He was bleeding out so badly after having his leg torn off, his chest scratched, and his right arm disfigured that he was trying to paddle with his only good hand left. But soon after that, he lost consciousness due to blood loss. He had sworn he died, but it doesn't stop there. From that point, he doesn't recall time passing or any of that. He remembers waking up and floating above his body being operated in, and the doctors and nurses rushing in and out trying to save his life. He was able to recall conversations, things that were said during the operation. He said he was out of his body and realized that he had died on the operating table. He recalled the doctors stressing that they had lost him and to keep trying. He said this went on for some time before he was sucked, his words, back into his body, where he regained consciousness days later in a hospital bed. He woke up and was told by the doctors and nurses that they don't understand how he's even alive, and he should have been dead by the sheer amount of blood he lost. He was pretty badly dinged up. In fact, they even announced him DOA, which, for those that don't know medical lingo, is dead on arrival when he showed up. But one of the doctors there wanted to pursue trying to save his life, and it's a good thing that doctor did, because had he not, well, my grandfather wouldn't be alive to talk about it. But it turns out there was another fisherman doing the same thing that my grandfather was that same day in the same area, and just so happened to be exploring that same area of swamp and found him unconscious, bleeding out on his capsized boat. Rescued his body and brought him back to shore, where he was even taken to the hospital. Like I said, he was announced DOA due to his blood loss, but the doctor who operated on him wanted to desperately and try to save him. I don't even know if that's proper protocol or if that's something doctors do or did, but that's what my grandfather tells me happened to him. His chest had been torn open, revealing muscle and tissue, his arm disfigured, and his leg torn off above the knee. He spent some time in the hospital, but ended up making a full recovery. Doctors considered him a miracle that he was still even able to walk. He now has a prosthetic leg, and after much physical therapy, he's able to work both his legs comfortably. He simply just tells me now that it wasn't his time to go, and that's why he did not die. As far as the things he encountered in that portion of the swamp, he explains them to be pure fear and called them Crocodilian people. I've asked him all sorts of questions regarding descriptions of what he saw, and if he can go into more detail on what it was that attacked him before I wrote this out to you. So here's more of what he told me. When it pulled him under the water, it grabbed onto him, ripping his chest open, but letting go, allowing him to pull himself up back onto his capsized boat before biting his leg and ripping it off. The teeth on these things were large, very similar to that of a Nile crocodile, but uglier and scarier looking. Now, personally, I don't really know how you can get scarier looking than a crocodile, but that's what he said. It was almost a smoky black-gray in color, with green reptilian looking eyes. The other one that ripped out his arm was more gray in color, and had slightly different head shape variation. A more narrow snout, is what he said. When it originally came out of the water and held onto his boat, it was standing up in the water with its entire upper body sticking out. It was a monster, pure and simple. He's not sure why he was allowed to live, because these things could have easily torn him limb from limb if they really wanted to, but they didn't. They didn't try to pull him off his capsized boat and eat him. He only was able to paddle a short distance before losing consciousness, so that means he must have drifted for a while before being found by the other fishermen, and the other fishermen stated that he was bleeding out bad and was very pale. I know it sounds crazy, but the man has scars on his body from this incident where his chest was sewn up, his prosthetic leg, and his arm. He's still alive and well today, and says even though that was the most terrifying thing to ever happen to him, he still goes out and does what he enjoys doing, which is being out fishing and hunting. I'm not sure if this constitutes as something you'd ever read on your channel, but I thought I'd send it to you anyway, because it does make for an interesting story. In 2007, 2008, and the first half of 2009, I was involved in distributing meth and other hard drugs. I had this partner of mine who would drive from California, meet me in Nevada, usually just outside of Las Vegas, and I would then drive it to different parts of the country, usually Texas, Kansas, or sometimes Illinois, depending on where my other partners would be. I don't engage in this lifestyle anymore, and haven't for a long time after getting clean myself. Many of my old partners and bosses are currently serving full prison terms, and I was lucky enough to get out before I got caught by the feds. There was one particular drug run we were doing back in the spring of 2008, where I was to meet my partner 100 miles south of Las Vegas, Nevada. This would be right around an area called Golden Valley in Arizona. We would meet just outside the area and transfer our deliverables. On this occasion, my partner never arrived at the location designated. I had waited a full 72 hours for him to arrive, and he never did. Finally, after getting a hold of him and meeting him at a different undisclosed location, he didn't have any of the product with him. On his way, before he reached the border to Nevada, he was driving early in the morning and was supposedly attacked by some unknown animal. He described it as a huge lizard, larger than he was. It attacked his car, and he simply fled. When he came back to his car, it did a number on his vehicle, and he ditched the drugs that were inside of it for fear he would get caught by the police. At this time, I didn't care what his reasoning was, even though his car was visibly torn up on the side, and his tire he was practically riding on was near flat. It had looked like he had gotten attacked by a pride of lions, but I didn't care. In a bout of anger, I pulled out my 9mm and put 2 bullets into his left hand, rendering it completely useless, and told him to call 911 as I left him there, bleeding out in agony. He would later be detained for messing up another future run of product through South Carolina, where he is currently serving a prison sentence. The person whom him and I both work for almost had him killed, but he somehow weaseled his way out of it. I continued in the business until mid-2009, when I realized the risk was getting incredibly high with how reckless aspects of the business were becoming, so I left that life behind, and then ended up getting clean. The man I used to work for also got caught years later, and is serving full-time in the feds. I know many of these details are not relevant, but in the last few years, I'd really grown to like these monster stories, and I know your channel has a bunch of them. This is really the only experience I have in my life that could somehow come close to that.